Okay, so here's my favorite part of this whole modeling process. Let me turn on my screencast keys. So let's get the lighting set up and we'll get our ground set up. So right now we have a point light. So instead of a material selection area, we have our lighting selection, but you can still use nodes to like change the lighting kind of like you would change material. But I don't want to use a point light. A point is as if this is just a single point like a light bulb. We want to use an area light, and I like to think of this as like a soft box, and you could use a rectangle and make any shape you want, which might actually be kind of cool. I was just going to use square, so there's only one little size we have to worry about. And as the light gets bigger, this energy has to increase if you want the lighting strength to be the same, because if we make this light huge, you can see the lighting actually decreases because it's a huge light with just 100 energy. But if you make it really tiny, then it's a really tiny light with with a 100 energy. So just keep in mind that there's kind of a balancing act going. But you know, that's probably a good size light, and I'll give it a bunch more energy. So that looks pretty cool. Let's see if I move this light over. We could also split the view, so I can just be in rendered mode and go over here and work on. So I kind of like that low lighting. I'm going to rotate it on the Y. Pull that back. So this is just tweaking it to however you like. But if we want to do like a 3-point lighting setup, we're only going to use 2 lights, but the easiest way is instead of adding, normally you would add a lamp and choose what kind of lamp you want. But instead of adding one, we already have a good base. So we could just duplicate this one. But right now it rotates around its origin because this is set to median point, where that's like our pivot point. If we set this to 3D cursor, you can see our little lines, our transform lines jump to the 3D cursor, and now you can like rotate it around that. So let's duplicate the lamp with Shift D, and before you do anything, hit R to rotate it and Z to constrain it to the Z axis. And now we have like this kind of cool lighting setup where 2 lights are on each side. Let's add some variation. Let's make the new one like bigger, maybe stronger and faster. No. Okay, so we can now change the color of each one. So just for some dramatic lighting, I think in the original one I used like a blue light. And you don't want to go like crazy, but just a subtle blue tint and then like a subtle red tint. I felt like it gave it kind of a cityscape feel. Okay, but now we're getting all this lighting from the world. This gray background is actually emitting light. So let's go to our world section, choose the color, and just scroll down to black. So now we have like much more dramatic lighting. Also, the size of your light affects the size, like the softness of the shadow. A bigger light gives you a softer shadow. A smaller light gives you a more crisp shadow. But let's see what happens. You can kind of see it's more crisp, but okay. So now we're going to texture this road. And previously on the sphere, we used the generated coordinate, which basically just by default, it like figures out how it just says, this is a sphere just stretched across a sphere. But for this road, we want to tell it which corner of this plane we want connected to the right corner of our picture. So let's add a new material, and I'm going to delete diffuse, add in a principled. You could just click P. You see P is underlined in principled, so if you open up shader and just hit P, and then drag that into surface. Now the shortcut Control T brings up all those nodes we needed, the texture, coordinate mapping, and image texture. I'm going to open my road texture, and nothing happens because we haven't defined our UV. So let's go to our UV. You don't have to go to the UV image editor, and right now by default it's looking for the render result, so just click out of that. So now we're really going to look at our UVs. So go into edit mode, and if you hit U, or you could type in spacebar unwrap, but U is the shortcut. So U, unwrap. Now this is what our, this corner, let's see, this corner and this corner match up. So if we were to like open our road and look in texture mode, as I move that corner, it's mapping it to this. So I could go move those two corners. I grabbed it on the X axis, but that looks like way too big. So I could grab these two corners and move it up on the Y, or just grab everything with select A and shrink it down a bit. Okay, so that's pretty decent. So now there's going to be a problem that comes up though. We did all that work. We want to make a curb, so I'm going to go back to solid mode, and we're in vertex select. So we're going to extrude up on the Z, so I just hit E, and I'm going to hit Z to constrain it to the Z axis, and then I'm going to hit E and constrain it to the Y. And now if we go into textured mode, there's like this weird stretching because these parts haven't been unwrapped yet, so they're basically smushed into that line. So I'm just going to unwrap everything again. Let's rotate it because it's now modifying based on our shape. So let's rotate it. If I hold control, it kind of locks it. Let's squish it. I'm scaling it on the Y and scaling it on the X. And I'll scale it back on the X. So I hit S and then X. Cool. So that looks like a pretty decent road. I'm going to move this, maybe stretch it that way. Okay, so in our camera mode, that's what our curve looks like. A couple things. I think that edge is way too sharp and that edge, so we want to bevel it. But we've been doing all this like scaling in object mode. So in properties panel, if you look at your scale, you usually want it to say 1, 1, and 1, but as you scale it, it's like it's changing it here. So to set your scale, Control A will apply the scale. I'm not going to do that yet. Let me show you what happens if we bevel the edges. So I'm going to go to edge mode, select these two edges, and Control B to bevel. Now as I bevel it, I just barely move the mouse, and it's doing these like really dramatic changes. But if you, back in object mode, apply the scale, back in edit, hit bevel now it knows to move just a little bit. So in Control B bevel mode, as you drag in and out, it increases, but you can also middle mouse wheel up and down to make it smooth. So instead of just those sharp things, you can make it smoother. And I'm just going to do something like that. And now we have like a much nicer curve. I think there would be more like a seam where these connected, but we're not going to worry about that today. So let's move on to our texture again. So just like the other one, we want some variety in the roughness and the normal, the height. So let's duplicate that node and drag in the vector. I'm going to control click and choose non-colored data. I'm going to go into a converter, color ramp. So oops, right now alpha selected. If you just keep doing control click, it alternates what you're looking. So black is 0 roughness, white is total roughness. So I want a wet looking ground. I'm going to invert these with that little button right there. And so I want a lot of wetness, but I want it to be like really contrasted with roughness. So everything black is going to be really reflective. Okay, so let's control click here. We'll pull that into the roughness, and now we have, it's almost too reflective. So let's bring that down. Yeah, you can start seeing, like, as I bring that down, the reflections get more broken up. So something like that. And I don't want to see that light so much right there, so I'm going to move it a little bit. Maybe increase the strength and the height. So you didn't need to do that. Okay, but let's add some, because if you look, I'm going to Shift B to just focus on this area. So we have some like variation in roughness, but let's get some depth. So we have what we need here, and I'm going to duplicate this color ramp and plug it in, plug the texture into it. And let's flip it back to this. So black is going to be deep points, white will be high points. Let's add a vector bump. It's by default, if you just drop it in there, it's on the wrong node. We want to, or the little circle, we want to plug it into height. And that's what it's going to look like. You can kind of get this impression of bumpiness, but if we like invert it, it looks better to me. And I'm going to decrease that height to like 0.5 or 0.2. If you have it at 1, that's like extreme bump, and you can get some like glitches when you do that. It's on 1 now, and it just doesn't look right to me. It almost looks like ice, and there's some weird black things. But if you do 0.1, maybe 0.2, you're starting to get some depth. Let me unplug it so you can see the difference. So let me plug it back in. Yeah, subtlety is better when you're going for realism. Okay, so now we have our ball, we have our street. Let's make it more reflective just for the heck of it. So I'm bringing in that black, and you can see the ball reflecting more right there, so that's cool. Yeah. Although I wish I could see more of the ball reflecting, we could just bring that back. Okay, so now let's animate the camera. So I'm gonna drag this over here. Here's our camera. Let's go to the beginning of our timeline where the ball bounces. We could, and then switch this to median point. There we go. So let's be farther away and up a little bit. And I'm just going to hit I and location, and that put our keyframe there. And then before the ball like totally stops bouncing, let's just drag it in, be down here, and hit I, location. So now our animation will look something like that. Let's go back to that first keyframe. Let's raise it up even more. And you could even add some rotation like on the X. So now hit I, loc, rot. So now it's putting keyframes on location and rotation. And go back to this keyframe. You know there's a keyframe selected because there's like a yellow, it turns yellow right there on your camera, or it's like right on that yellow line. And let's bring it in and look up a bit with rotating, and then loc, rot. So I'm going to move that, go to your dope sheet, and just choose this to look at only your camera, that little mouse button right there. So let's move these a bit back. Alt A plays if you don't have your play button. Or move it in. Let's see if it looks better. Dun, dun, dun. So that looks fine to me. Okay, so let's go to render settings. So you guys are going to use your CPU. Make it 100%. If we're short on time, maybe make this 50%. Let's do the 50. We want to switch this to JPEG because we want an image sequence. Our sampling, let's just change it to 32. The higher the render samples, the longer it takes, but the nicer it looks. And choose a folder where you want to. So I'm going to go to my desktop, make a new folder up here and say like render ball final, and then just choose that folder. We're in render ball final, hit accept. And then once you click animate, it'll start rendering your scene. The last thing, turn on motion blur because that'll give it some realism. So one thing I wish I would have done before I clicked animate was click this little stopwatch here, and this will just every render is going to have what's called noise, like a little grain, and this will just add kind of a more natural noise pattern to your video. If you don't leave it checked, the noise stays like totally still, and it just doesn't look like actual video would look like, because noise in video is like static, it's always changing. So click that before you hit render.